So good morning, everybody. Believe it or not, Lloyd, we have snow up here right now.
I'm not surprised.
You know, we always think North Bay is just north enough to be perfect. You know, it doesn't start at Barrie, but yeah, today it says, yes, we are north enough. So,
We had snow here in Toronto last weekend.
oh,
You know,
you
just
did?
the day before, I was saying, am I going to take the studded tires off my e-bike yet? And my daughter, who also has one, said, no, I think we should wait. And sure enough, we had snow all weekend.
Oh, wow. I didn't know you could get
Last week.
studded tires for your bike.
Oh,
Jeez.
yeah.
Wow. Okay. So good morning, everyone. I just feel so honored to have the author of this wonderful book, Living the 1.5 Degree Lifestyle by Lloyd Alter, Canadian from Toronto. He's a writer, public speaker, former architect, developer, and inventor. He's published thousands of articles in Treehugger and Mother Nature Network and has contributed to The Guardian, Corporate Knights, and Azure magazines. I really like this part of your bio. He's become convinced that we just use too much of everything. Too much space, too much land, too much food, too much fuel, too much money. And that the key to sustainability is to simply use less, what he calls radical sufficiency. We got to remember that little phrase. Beautiful. He teaches sustainable design at Ryerson School of Interior Design. And when not writing, he can often be found in his running shoes, on his e-bike in Toronto, or in his 1989 Hudson single scull. You should bring that up here. We have 35 lakes in this little community. It's awesome. So please welcome Lloyd Alter. Yay, Lloyd, welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here. I have to tell you that I woke up in the middle of the night last night thinking about, well, I'm talking to people in North Bay and this talk is so Toronto centric. They're going to look at me and saying, oh, that's just some Toronto guy doing this. And I basically got out of bed at 5 this morning and reworked a lot of this presentation because I felt, no, I can't do this. I have to acknowledge because as I'll talk about, you know, what I did to live a 1.5 degree lifestyle is something that I believe in North Bay would be almost impossible to do. And so I reworked the talk to see what kind of things can you do, what kind of changes that you can make, which, you know, I could make living in the city, but you can't make up there. So I will talk about that. And so this may not be as smooth as my talk usually is, A, because I'm tired from being up half the night, and B, because it's the first time I've done it in this exact way. So I will share screen and we will start. Hang on. Technical trouble already. Share. So do you see my splash screen just to make sure it's
yes,
okay?
Yes, we do. Everything is good, Lloyd. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. Now, when I wrote this book, the book came out, I finished the book, I guess, almost a year ago, and it was published last September. And a few things have happened in the meantime. Like a few weeks ago, there was this massive report, the part 3 of the IPCC report on climate change. And there's a lot of in this report that's very similar to what's in my book. In fact, we used a lot of the same sources. Now, this sort of dropped on the world, and we all loved this headline, Earth on track to be unlivable, story on page 3. You know, it doesn't even make the first page of the newspaper, but that's what happens there. I think everybody was talking about Will Smith. You know, it was a much bigger deal, that slap on the Academy Awards, than this. But we know, if people have followed anything in the issues of climate change, we know that the world started dramatically warming with the Industrial Revolution and the burning of coal and the introduction of the automobile, which are the 2 biggest things that did this. And it's common knowledge this is happening, but nobody was taking this all very seriously because, of course, our world runs on oil. Finally, in 2015, there was this big conference in Paris, the COP21 conference, that set some limits that countries from around the world agreed to on the amount of carbon emissions, the carbon budget, and a schedule to be net zero by 2050, and limits of 2 degrees they set of 2 degrees Celsius warming, which would require some really, really steep decline in our carbon emissions to actually succeed in doing this. And then in 2018, they said, well, wait a second, we have to look at this because the effects of 2.2 degrees are too terrible, and we have to go to 1.5 degrees, which no longer looked like a ramp, but starts to look like a cliff. And that's where the 1.5 degree in my title, and it came from. And a lot of people are saying, well, we can't do this. It's out of reach. Why won't anyone admit it? And a lot of people won't admit it because we've done some fabulous things. The prices of photovoltaics have dropped like mad, offshore wind, solar power, batteries for electric cars. The market, people have been responding and their changes have been happening. And as Amy Westervelt, a really good writer about climate issues, noted recently, the report made one thing clear: the technologies and policies to do this exist. The obstacles are politics and fossil fuel interests. Now, a lot of my book talks about what's called your carbon footprint, your personal carbon footprint. And a lot of people say carbon footprints don't really exist. It was all marketing, it was a fraud, it was invented by British Petroleum to blame us for what we're doing. And all kinds of people say this. I love the student from Trent University who said, we need to stop blaming everyday people for the declining environment and start holding the real culprit responsible, the fossil fuel industry. And, you know, even Michael Mann, one of the leading climate scientists, said that personal actions actually undermine support for substantive climate policies. That's convenient for fossil fuel companies like ExxonMobil, Shell, and BP. You know, they're saying personal responsibility doesn't matter at all. Then another, the most famous headline in The Guardian ever, came out saying just 100 companies are responsible for 71% of global emissions. And I've been collecting tweets of people who are using this as the excuse to do just about anything. 100 companies are responsible. My air conditioning has nothing to do with it. Buying Bitcoin has nothing to do with it. Eating my hamburger has nothing to do with it. So this has become the go-to excuse. But when you actually look at the report that headline was based on, you find that we're not talking about oil companies. We're talking about countries: China, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Iran, ExxonMobil. And you also find out that what they're talking about, this is very important, the difference between scope 1 and scope 3 emissions. 90% of the carbon that comes from those companies is what we burn in our tanks. We're buying what they're selling, we're putting it in the tanks. And so they're really our emissions, not their emissions. And it's the same with the gas. I'm not sure if North Bay, if you've got natural gas now, but like, it's the same with the gas. You know, we got locked into this. I have a gas furnace behind me. We made choices that made sense at the time, but don't now. And as the IPC says, every bit of climate action matters, every bit of warming matters, every year matters, and every choice we make matters. Now, what's a 1.5 degree lifestyle, which is what I've been trying to live? What it is that about 5 years ago, a study came out of Aalto University in Finland that basically looked at what we have to do to change our lives to keep the temperature rise below 1.5 degrees. And this assumes that these emissions are caused by consumption, about us buying stuff. And they base this on a study I'll get into. I learned about it from a woman in London who basically said, I'm going to try and live on a 2050 carbon budget. And so she was saying the EU citizen emits 8 tons, the American 16 tons. I'm going to live in 1 ton of carbon per year. And her rationale for that was this from that study that basically it said that we have to cut our emissions in half by 2030 and to net zero in 2050. And Rosalind was taking the 2050 number, which meant you take all the carbon we're allowed to have in the world, you divide by the population, and you get 1 ton per person. I looked at that and said, that's ridiculous. That's like background radiation, background noise, the way where I live. Couldn't possibly do it. So I was going to take the 2030, the 1.5 degree budget in 2030 would be 2.5 tons of carbon per year. And that's what my book is about. Can I live like a 2.5 ton budget of carbon? And that's all based on these other studies that said lifestyle emissions, the amount we control, can actually control ourselves is about 72% of all our carbon. The rest is the government and other things that are out of our choices. And 2.5 tons is a number that's talked about a lot. Half the world lives with less than 2.5 tons, and they're living in energy poverty. They basically don't have enough to keep warm or to cook their food. They've got to be brought up to it. And you can see way up in the upper right-hand side, just below the United States, at per capita emissions between 15 and 20 tons. And again, half the 49%, the richest 10% of the world are 49% of combustion emissions, and 10%, the richest 10% sounds like a lot of money, but it's about $119,000 Canadian on the way that they're talking about this. And the richest 1% are about 15% of the carbon. They're the ones who have the most significant emissions. Now, after that report came out 5 years ago, another one came out last year, actually, just after I finished my book, that updated it with a bigger crude. And this time they included Canada in the countries they looked at. You can see that Canadians on their graph compared to Europeans and Finns again, and everybody else, we have the biggest footprint. And it actually makes some sense. We've got housing, which is heating our housing is a very big deal. And we do a lot of driving, and that's transportation. And
so that number, Lloyd, that number 14.2 is an individual number, like per individual.
Yes, that's lifestyle emissions, the things we have choices about. So our full average per capita emissions in Canada are about 17, but the 3 are, the government buying jet planes and things like that, and other things that we don't control. Whereas we're buying food, we're picking our house, we're driving our cars, and we're buying goods. And that's what's adding up to the 14.2. Those are the lifestyle. Now, I used the older book, from the book, which basically had these 6 categories: nutrition, what we eat; housing, how we live; mobility, how we get around; goods that we buy. And I built a giant spreadsheet to look at everything, and divided that 2.5 tons so that it came out to 6.8 kilograms of carbon a day. And I was going to track everything that I did and everything. But this is very hard because you've got to understand, let's say I buy an air conditioner. It's very easy to know how much it costs to operate the air conditioner, but the air conditioner is made in China. So are the emissions that come from making it, are they Chinese or they're mine? If you look at a consumption basis, you have to assume that those emissions are mine, that, I exported them to China, they come out there, but they're on my side of the ledger. And this is what's known in the building industry as embodied carbon, they call it. It's the carbon from making stuff. Sort of, if you're building a house, it's all the stuff underneath. And I think embodied carbon is a terrible name. It's not embodied, it's in the air already. And so I said about in 2019, let's call it upfront carbon. And this has become a term that's become quite common now. And in architecture, this is why everybody's building things out of wood. I thought I'd change this picture to one of the architecture school in Sudbury, which is the first big wood building in Ontario. I guess that's later. And when you're looking about buildings, everyone talks about it. But it's everywhere. Like if I take my little iPhone costs almost, there's costs almost no energy to run, but it took 80 kilograms of materials and stuff to build it. All the source materials, the manufacturing and everything, put 80 kilograms of carbon dioxide into the air and upfront emissions. And this is really huge. I can't lift 80 kilograms. If you're out weightlifting, maybe you can, but it's a lot. And it's all in that little phone. 86% of the carbon involved and only 13 from operating it. And nobody understands this. I mean, car manufacturers, here's Hyundai doing an ad for their electric car and say, why shouldn't a car have the same emissions as a bike? And some graffiti guy went in and said, because of the carbon embodied in the materials from making it. You know, someone had to actually tell Hyundai what to do. Because nobody tells us, you know, Ford is like selling this new electric pickup truck and everybody says this is going to save the world, but nobody tells you how much carbon it took to make it. So now let's get into the details of the book. Now that I've explained, we're going to start with nutrition. And this is, again, how do I calculate this? Diet is one of the three biggest hot spots. So I wanted to say, okay, let's take something I eat all the time. I used to eat all the time. I always loved Swiss chalet. And so how do I calculate it? Well, first of all, I have to find out, well, what's the chicken itself, raising a chicken? This is not easy data to find. I got this data, this information, 1431, from an English book that talks about carbon footprint, but I know in Canada it's going to be different. Our chickens are probably traveling farther. They probably have to put more heat into the building in the wintertime to keep them alive, but I've got to start somewhere. Then I went and looked in all the catalogs to find out how much does it cost to cook it, and in terms of gas to run the units. And this I could find because, of course, I could read how many chickens go in an oven and how much energy to run the oven. Then I weighed all the plastic that it came with to find out what that was. And then I measured how far it was for the guy to drive it to deliver to my house. And lo and behold, driving the chicken to my house blew everything else away. It was 37 grams compared to 366, compared to 72, compared to 1431. So I quickly learned I can't do home delivery unless it's close. The other thing that also out of England is that, you know, everyone says, oh, well, we've got to go vegan or we've got to go vegetarian. But it's not true because different foods actually have different carbon footprints. Beef, for instance, is the worst by far because they last a long time. They're alive for a couple of years. They're fed a lot of grain, which has a high, and worst of all, they're ruminants. They actually fart and belch out methane gas. So that's what we're measuring here. So that's why beef is so high. Prawns are high because they're all shipped from around the world. Lamb is a ruminant, but not as bad. And then what? Tomatoes? Why are tomatoes worse than fish and cheese? Well, tomatoes, except for the one season you get out of the ground, are either grown in hothouses that are fired by natural gas, or they're imported from Mexico or California. So that tomatoes are really high. And then there's fish, and then there's cheese, which is dairy, and cheese is actually worse than chicken, and milk and pig. So, you know what I say? Well, you don't have to be a vegan. Being a vegan would be the best because you're eating everything below the eggs there. But even that, being a vegan, they'll say, well, I'm a vegan, but I eat lots of tomatoes. No, you can't eat tomatoes anymore. So you have to be what I would call a climatarian. And this is a term that's been used for a while, where you're picking your diet according to climate. Now, then there's the whole issue of the supply chain, the shipping. The people who did this chart said the shipping isn't a very big deal. I happen to think they're wrong. My dad was in the shipping business, and I know how trucks work, and they totally left out the refrigeration. And this is one thing when I was thinking about North Bay, that boy, I bet a chart of this done for North Bay, where everything that you eat is coming by transport trailer, is going to be a very different picture. Because the distribution is actually a big issue. And some say it's responsible for 10% of emissions, the whole cold chain from where it comes. So what we did is basically what I did is I gave up red meat for this experiment. A little chicken is fine, doesn't put out as much. It's not about being a vegetarian. I should give up cheese, but my daughter runs a cheese shop, so that's very hard to do. I get the best cheese in the world, so it's our basic big weakness. Cutting down waste is huge. 40% of our food is going is wasted, and 20% of that is in the store and getting to the store, but a whole bunch of it is in the back of our fridges. And the other thing that's changed over 20 years is portion sizes. We're eating way, way bigger portions than our parents did, just because food as a proportion of income has gotten cheaper, and we're getting more takeout food. And for them, the food cost is actually not the biggest cost, so they get more customers by offering you bigger portions. But you just look at what people ate 50 years ago in terms of a portion to what they did today, and it's completely different. The other thing that we did was that we led a sort of seasonal diet to beat that problem of shipping. Now, 10 years ago, when my wife was a food writer, we lived what would be a seasonal 19th century Ontario diet. Which was a lot of root vegetables, parsnips, potatoes, turnips, and more potatoes and more turnips, and lots of meat, because meat, is on the hoof all winter long, and people could eat the meat. And those 19th century Scots and English didn't have access to or didn't accept the wonderful ways that we know to cook now with tofu and with Asian food and with Chinese dishes and Indian food. So our diet is probably a lot more varied than your 19th century Scot or Englishman in Canada would have, but it was still limited to those things that they could get. And of course, my wife every year cans vast amounts of tomatoes so that we're never eating those hothouse or imported tomatoes. So with food, it became fairly straightforward. We've supersized everything and supersized ourselves. And, Michael Pollan's famous rule was eat food, not too much, mostly plants. But what we did is, try to eat less red meat, eat a little less of dairy, fish, chicken, and pork, but it is a fraction of the carbon footprint of beef. And it's shorten the food chain and buy local and seasonal if you can. Learn to love leftovers and throw it as little as possible. Manage portion sizes and don't cook more than you need. And as I say here, it's surprising how big the impact of that is. How we live. Now, this is the one I woke up in the morning and said, oh, wow, this is terrible. This is so Toronto-centric. I mean, I live at the top of the escarpment, the hill in Toronto that 150 years ago was farmland, and the rich people lived there in these estates of Hardwald and Spadina, and they couldn't get up there because of these hills, the ravine that separated it. Oh, these are out of order. I don't know why. So this was an example of the hill that you had to get across to get up to the top. Then in 1913, they took all the crap out of coal furnaces and all the garbage, and they started filling up the ravine to connect the two sides there. And that's how it looked at the end of it. And that's how it still looks today. This is the same thing. And they put the streetcar in that would go along St. Clair Avenue where I live. And so in 1890, this was all farmland. And then the developers moved in, and bingo, 25 years later, it was completely built out. And my house is the one in the middle. You can see the three are identical. It's sort of spec developer houses from 1913. And I'm a lucky baby boomer and paid very little for it. And after the kids grew up, I wanted to sell, but my wife didn't. So we duplexed it. We cut it in half, and we live in the ground floor and my lovely office here in the lower level. And we rent the upstairs. So happens to my daughter and her husband and my lovely granddaughter. And St. Clair, which had the streetcars, still has the streetcars, remarkably, unlike most of the world. And it is what you would call a 15-minute city, that we can get almost everything we need within walking distance. I could, if I wanted, rent office space at a co-working space. And since nobody's going into the cubicles to work anymore, so many people were working at home, which traditionally 300 years ago, everybody did. You lived on top of the store, you lived on top of the shop. health clinic opened up so I can walk up to my doctor. I can get everything that I need within walking distance. And I bet North Bay 50 years ago was a small town that was the same thing. You lived in the houses within walking distance of the main street where the grocery was and everything was, because not everybody had a car, and that the town developed. And that's how towns all over were. I was doing this talk in Amherstburg and I looked into the history of that, and that's how people lived. The real point is that this guy, I think, is a brilliant theorist on that, that land use and transportation are the same thing. This book I separated how we live and how we get around, but it's really the same thing. It's my house works because of the development pattern is based on the streetcar. We have a car that my wife drives. I don't drive very much at all anymore, but how you get around determines what you build and what you build determines how you get around. Now, 35 years ago, when I was an architect, I did a cottage on Lake of Bays, and I went into the real estate office to make a photocopy and saw a picture of this geodesic dome on a little lake near Dorset, Ontario. And I just said I had to buy that. And I bought it, and it was rotten when we bought it. I opened the door and it fell right off the hinges and almost crushed my 6-month-old daughter in my arm. And basically it went away, and this is what I have now. And I spent 3 months of the year up here in Dorset. I don't know if you must know Dorset's like half an hour from Huntsville, just south of on Lake Bays. We're in a little lake away from it. And I work all summer up there when the cat lets me. And, it's water access. So I have to use this gas-fired motorboat to go just about where the sun's setting, where the dock is. And if we drive into Huntsville in the farmer's market, the 38-kilometer round trip comes out to almost my daily allocation of carbon, the 6.8 kilograms of carbon, because I'm driving a gasoline car. And I drive a little gasoline car, the Subaru there, which, I took this because I'm always so amazed at how big the pickup trucks are, that side by side, it's just so big. And of course, you see so many of them. And so I just added those this morning to show that I have a little bit of comprehension of what it's like, how you have to live with a car up north. In the States, it's a similar situation, that after the Second World War, Dwight Eisenhower thought, if they're going to bomb us with nuclear bombs, we've got to disperse. We've got to move people out of the cities. So we're going to build these defense highways. And, after Miss Concrete and Miss Blacktop cut all the ribbons on these highways, they moved all the companies out there, because when everybody was in New York, one nuclear bomb was going to take everything out. And so, IBM here moved to Rochester, and other people moved everywhere else. And they got all the white people to move into these wonderful subdivisions where they could drive to their new offices. And the whole culture was about, let's get people out of the cities. So this is, everybody thinks, well, why are American cities so different? Why did they go through the horrible things they went through? And a major part of it, this was government policy. Let's get everybody out of the cities so that, we can defend them. And they left a lot of people behind, as you well know. But if you were white and if you got a GI Bill loan, you would have this dream. This was the future we wanted, the suburban house and the suburban job and the car to connect the two. And this is still the dream. This is Elon Musk selling introducing it's the future we want, he called it. And it's still the dream. And is Elon Musk's proposed dream is, well, we'll just make it electric so that everybody will live in the big family house, but it'll have solar powered shingles, it'll have a Tesla in the garage and a power wall on the wall. A lovely idea, but you can imagine it doesn't scale. And remember our talk about upfront carbon emissions. It takes a lot to make this. Just putting it, they're all going in the air. Now in Europe, everybody raises their families like here, this is a picture outside of Munich, where they build little apartment buildings and they raise all their families there, and there are no single family houses at all. In the cities, they're not even legal. So we know what to do in our cities, how to solve the problem, how to live at the higher densities that you need to support stores. Here's Sudbury. We know how to build with low upfront carbon materials. There's more and more people building out of wood. Now in Ontario, 74%, 76% of houses are built with gas, fired with gas, and Doug Ford is spending millions and millions of dollars to expand natural gas to rural Ontario, saying everybody's paying too much for their electric and oil heat, which, because gas has a huge carbon footprint, is the last thing that we should be doing, when in fact, when it's going to cost, by the way, they estimate $26,000 per house that the government's paying to do it. Whereas in Canada, we know how to build houses that emit no operating carbon. You may have heard of the word passive house as a design of energy efficient house, but it was actually invented in the mid-70s in Regina, Saskatchewan, where these two engineers were asked to build a solar powered house because solar power was all the rage then. And they said, we're in Regina. The sun is not there. It's really cold. It won't work. So they developed this idea of wrapping the house in this huge layer of insulation and getting a little bit of sun in the south wall and developing an air exchange system. And the government said, we wanted solar power. You said you'd give us solar power. And they said, it's stupid. So they compromised and they put those solar panels, those solar collectors, you can see them on the top there, that cost as much as the house to put in the solar heating system there. And it lasted 3 years. It kept breaking down. It didn't work. So it was a complete waste, and they didn't need it because the house uses almost no heat. And this guy, a physicist in Germany, saw this and studied this. And Wolfgang Feist built the first passive house, as it's called, in Germany. This is it, which is basically an envelope that's just super insulated, high quality windows, and an air-to-air heat exchanger to bring in fresh air. And this is how we should all be living in cold climates. You can do them anywhere and it costs you nothing to heat. And the passive house people finally realized this a few years ago, and they brought Harold Orr over from Regina, Saskatchewan, and gave him a big award recognizing him as the pioneer of energy efficient building. And the Canadian government actually recognized this too, giving him an Order of Canada, which totally shocked him completely that anyone in Canada even recognized the importance of his work. But there he is getting it. And this is what the wall looks like. It's filled with shredded newspaper and triple glazing. And when you have a wall like that, you don't need any heat. In North Bay, you probably don't need any heat. I know a couple of people in cold climates who have put them in, and they put a little wood stove in just in case, and they maybe fire it up once a year. We also have heat pumps now, which we didn't have a few years ago, that work in really cold climates. They used to fail when it got below freezing, and now they go down to -10 Celsius before you start running into issues that they can't suck enough heat out of the air. So what do we do in housing? In new buildings, we have to build low embodied carbon materials to a really high standard like passive house. It's the only way we should be building. And in existing buildings, instead of bringing in gas, we should be reducing demand as much as possible by sealing, by insulating where we can, and meeting the difference with a heat pump. Now we're getting into move, which is pretty much, as I said, so closely related. And basically what's happened is that as cars got mandated to be more efficient, what happened? People said, well, it doesn't cost as much to run. I'm going to get a bigger one. And so cars have just grown and grown and grown because the government said, well, they're trucks, so they shouldn't be treated like cars because people work with them. So this is considered a truck. And of course, these are considered a truck. And, you know, this is where I had a page and a half about living up north in my book about how hard it is because the economy runs on petroleum and everybody has long distances to go and a lot of energy to heat. And, you know, I get all self-righteous because I'm in my little rowing shell around the lake, but takes me 5 days worth of carbon to get up the 250 kilometers from Toronto there. So my argument, there I am on my lake with that. My argument that I'm so holier than thou by using this instead of a wakeboard boat doesn't really apply when I'm in fact driving up there. Now we do try to just drive up as little as possible, come up in June and go back in September, but it's a footprint. And people's approaches and attitudes have not changed in 50 years. I mean, this is a guy 50 years ago with the American dream, the big house, the station wagon pulling the boat. And then you look at the Ford ad from like last week, and it's a bigger house, a bigger truck, and a bigger boat. But it's exactly the same thing. I mean, these are our ambitions. It's as Elon Musk said, the future we want. The difference is it's electric. But electric cars still have that carbon footprint. They also still park on the sidewalk, they still clog the roads, but you know, they're still about half as bad as a regular car, a third to a half, because of all the metal that goes into them, all of the stuff to make the batteries. I did a study and found that if you got a really small gasoline powered car and compared it to the new Ford F-150 electric, it was actually better. I wrote an article about it, and the boss of our very big company read it and said, "You guys are supposed to be promoting electric cars. How can you say they're worse?" And I got in some trouble for this and don't do this anymore. But the fact is that it's true. And you know, North Americans are obsessed with the car. In Toronto, what I did was that I said, well, I can't drive the car. So I got myself this lovely e-bike. After trying all kinds of them, I bought this one. And in winter, you have to dress really warmly. This was me just a few weeks ago, you know, but where's that old line? There's no such thing as bad weather, just inappropriate clothing. And so I took all my old ski gear, my ski gloves, my ski helmet, and I could go quite comfortably. It helps if you've got a nice, safe place to ride. Like here, if you look at how they lay out a street in Vienna, you got a place to walk, a place to bike, a place to wait for the streetcar, and what's left they give to the car. And when the pandemic hit, they actually set up Toronto that it looked almost like Vienna, but they've ripped most of this out now. And the biggest problem is, you know, it's really hard to fly. Nobody's solved the problem of aviation. I had to go to meet the new boss when our company got sold, and I went off to New York, and just a 36-hour trip to New York was a month's worth of carbon blown in 36 hours. So, you know, what can you do? Well, I can say in Toronto, get rid of your car. It's the biggest single factor in your footprint. I didn't say, I said, get out of your car. I didn't say, get rid of your car. We still have one so that we come up in the summer. And where you can, walk, bike, e-bike, cargo bikes, and fly as little as possible. Now here's consumption. And this is an interesting one. This one shocked me. In the original report, they didn't have a big number on consumption, but I have this Apple fetish. I have to own everything that they make. And here I am. I've got my Apple Watch. I've got my Apple earphones. I got my iPad. I've got the big screen I'm looking at. And as I said before, they all have this embodied carbon that it took to make them. And I add them up. Even my little silly watch here has a footprint of 38 kilograms. So when I total that all up, that's 1.1 tons of carbon, which you divide by their lifetime, and it's like 400 kilograms a year. It's 16% of my annual budget. It's the single biggest item after my silly gas furnace behind me, because I have a gas furnace, I must admit. Now, the other thing that I didn't talk about, the other source of information was this other report, The Future of Consumption in a 1.5'C world. And this brought up the issue of clothing. I never thought about clothing and didn't put it in my book because, you know, I'm an architect of a certain age and all we ever wear are black turtlenecks. So I never have an issue of clothing, but a lot of people do. It's a huge issue. And it's bigger than equipment, it's bigger than computers, it's bigger than transit for a lot of people in cities. So an English organization came up looking at that report and really said, well, what do? We basically cut back everything, you know, keep products longer, fly less, eat more plant-based food, buy less new clothing, use your personal vehicle less. But the other thing we have to look at is, the idea of how we use things. And I always think the best example is the good old beer store. And what happens in the beer store? Well, it's what they call circularity. You buy your beer in a returnable bottle and you take it back and they clean it and refill it. And it's incredibly energy efficient. And we're all used to it. We've done it for years. And I know that they're trying to kill it. Doug Ford doesn't like it. You cannot hardly find bottled beer anymore. It's all in cans, but it's still there. And we all used to live like this. People used to get their milk this way. It would be delivered by the milkman. This guy's even delivering cornflakes. Home delivery was totally common before Amazon. And Coke, as my favorite example, there were local Coca-Cola bottling companies in every city because it was a glass bottle. It was expensive to ship over long distance and take back. So this is how you got Coke, and this is how you got beer. O'Keefe's, which doesn't even exist anymore, had 5 breweries just in Ontario, because again, beer was something that was more local. So where were these looking down here? They were in Windsor, Toronto, the print's too small. That was just that. And then this guy came along, Bill Coors, and he invented the 2-piece aluminum can. And it changed everything because he had those new highways and he basically could centralize everything, reduce costs dramatically, service everybody from one big brewery in Denver, and put everyone else out of business, which is why now it's called Molson Coors and it's owned by Brazilians, because the whole thing got globalized because of that transport. And everybody figured this out, why McDonald's succeeded because he didn't have to pay waiters and waitresses. He didn't need to pay rent and tables. He outsourced all of that to the front seat of our cars so that suddenly we were doing what he used to do. And it only worked if you had disposables. And disposables were, well, we didn't know what to do with them. When I was a kid, you saw crap, you threw it in the ground. It looked like this in the dock next to it because people didn't know. And there weren't the waste, but they outsourced this to us and we had to be taught. And so that's why they started Keep America Beautiful. Susan Spotless says every litter bit hurts. And so all the litter was being picked up and going to dumps, and the dumps were getting full and cities were getting mad and they wanted to go back to returnables. So they got industries invented recycling. We're going to take everything back and we're going to recycle it. And they trained us from childhood. We're trained from childhood that recycling is the greatest thing you can do. My granddaughter plays with a recycling truck. Whoever played with a garbage truck? No, but recycling is different. It's clean and it's fun, and Paw Patrol, Rocky does it, everybody does it. And when you look at surveys of what people think is the most important thing that you can do in the world to create an environment that lets you live a healthier life, recycling? Or this study that just came out 2 days ago that said, what's the most important thing you can do to limit your own contribution to climate change? And, packaging, get rid of, reduced packaging. I mean, no idea of the importance and the priorities of it. And we know that recycling doesn't work. In fact, what we've got is 32% of everything going into the environment, 40% of it landfilled, 14% gets collected, of which only 2% is actually fully recycled. And the industry wants to say, oh, we're going to go circular. We'll take everything back and we'll reduce it back to the chemicals that it's made of, and it will all be fine. But we know that's not true. It doesn't get collected. It's really, they want this all as a way of just selling more petrochemicals, which are turned into plastic and then into garbage. And we know people won't pick it up because you just look at any Tim Hortons lot where people could just garbage cans everywhere and it still looks like this because basically, I guess, what can I say? A lot of us are slobs, but like the recycling's not going to work unless we're actually doing it. which is why I always say, you know, we've got to go back and just get rid of the single-use ones. If you want a coffee, go in, sit down, drink a coffee out of a porcelain cup, give it back to them. We have to get rid of this culture of convenience, sit down and enjoy the coffee, and rethink the system to get circularity like we've had in the beer store for everything. So from computers to clothing, what the principle is, sufficiency applies. How much do we need? For any consumer good, the best strategy is to buy high quality with timeless design, maintain it well, and use it for as long as possible. And this is the rule for everything. And I'm going to be wearing a watch and using this iPhone 11 when they're up at iPhone 22. I hope it still works. For leisure, I won't go very much onto leisure, other than to point out that I used to love driving 2 hours north to Collingwood to get winched up a hill electricity with an electric winch to slide down on top of electrically made artificial snow and then drive back. And then when I started this project, what I would do is I would basically strap my cross-country skis and my e-bike and go to High Park. And I enjoyed it because it was exercise, it was healthy, and it was fit, and it didn't involve driving. And it was as much fun or more fun than the snowboarding. And I was so thrilled to look on your website and see you guys do the same thing, that you're out there, you're not in snowmobiles, you're not doing all this stuff, but you're out there in the air getting exercise, and it's free. And this is what we have to do. It's not a matter of saying, oh, I have to give something up and not ever have fun again. It's about saying we're going to have a different kind of fun. And you know what? It's healthier and it's better. And so this is, I think, key. I was thrilled looking through your website to see how much of this stuff that you guys are actually doing. So in conclusion, it's pretty straightforward. My carbon footprint was a simple story. Don't eat red meat, don't drive the car, don't get in an airplane. But there's other points that are also really important. The embodied carbon, the upfront carbon emissions of making stuff are actually more important than the operating stuff. You've got to just stop buying so much stuff. And how we live and how we get around are really the same issue. And you don't all have to turn vegan, just eat a lot less red meat. If I was in the city, you know, what I would dream that our city would be like, this is Stockholm in 1928, where everybody's cycling and taking trams. And I'd love to see Toronto colorize this and make it Toronto in 2028. I know that's not going to work in North Bay, but what does work and what's really important is this table that came out in November, that all of these things I've talked about, you know, efficiency, not driving, not food waste and that, if you plot them against all these things across the top about well-being, there's health, there's social cohesion, meeting people, there's energy saving, there's education and communications, you know, as soon as you start doing all these things that like you're doing when you're out walking on those trails, it's better for everybody, your health, your well-being and everything. It's like that cartoon, you know, what if we made a better world for nothing with green jobs, livable cities and renewables and that, you know, it's better. Even if you didn't have a climate change problem, it's better. So I end up with the slide from those English people about sufficiency again, that I love their statement. Their motto is less stuff, more joy. And I think it's true. And so I borrowed that for my conclusion. Thanks very much. And I totally forgot to stop for questions. I'm so sorry. I just kept going.
You're on mute, Harriet.
Well, you saw from the look on my face, I'm very, very, so pleased with your presentation. It's awesome. And you might like to know tomorrow, we're all going to do our, well, I hope, we're going to do our personal carbon footprint. We're doing, we're going to do it online with our, what, carbon footprint iPhones. So.
Excellent.
But questions, anybody? Okay, Debbie? You're muted.
Sorry. What are your thoughts on geothermal heating?
Geothermal heating, well, there's like two kinds. There's real true geothermal, which is what you have in Iceland and what you have where you drill down and get the heat from the core. And there's what people call geothermal, which are ground source heat pumps, which I think a lot of people are doing. Is that what you're talking about, where they drill down and basically have a heat pump?
Yes.
And yeah, 20 years ago, everybody was doing them and thought these were the real answer, but they're really expensive. And so they didn't become as popular. And what's happened is the air source heat pumps that I showed a picture of have really taken over the market because they're so much cheaper. And I bet if you called up contractors in North Bay, they'll all say, oh, they won't work here, they won't work here. It's too cold. But in fact, they're getting better every year. It's a real engineering revolution. And so the electric ones, the new electric air source ones are really terrific. The other thing is, if you live on a lake, is there are these wonderful systems that you actually throw it in the lake and use the lake instead of the ground. And there's a company in Carnarvon, just down Highway 35, south of, not much south of 60, that just north of Minden, that has this wonderful unit that's a whole coil of pipes in that, and you throw that in the lake, and the lake is much more efficient than the ground actually as a heat transfer medium. So if you have a place in the lake, that is, I think, something that's better than the ground source heat pump. Geothermal as a word has been terribly misused. That's what you get in Iceland. That's what you get on volcanoes. But it sounds good.
Another question here. Thank you, Lloyd. Roseanne.
First of all, thank you for that presentation. It was wonderful. I don't think anybody wanted to interrupt you for questions while you were on a roll. But I do have a question about your strong belief in wood use for building homes. Can that kind of process sustain itself when we talk about needing more trees being planted versus cutting down more trees to build?
Well, it's got to be sustainable forestry. It's got to be sustainable timber, where if you take down a tree, you plant one to replace it. And this is what's done in much of Canada and most of Canada, just to get the rights to do trees. There are different certification systems, but it's very hard to find lumber that is done in Ontario, for instance, that isn't under a certain form of certification. And we've got trees. We don't have these other materials. Making cement, making concrete block takes a huge amount of energy. It releases a huge amount of carbon. Trees are considered still carbon neutral. And for housing in particular, you don't use that much wood. For all of that stuff, the building that I showed in North Bay was made with wood out of Quebec, because at the time Ontario didn't have a factory to make that kind of wood. And the factory in Quebec has been doing sustainable harvesting for 50 years. It's got certifications for everything. Canadian trees grow more slowly than they do further south, but they replant for every single tree they cut down, and they can show you how sustainable their wood production is. And it's not perfect. I agree with you. We'd prefer not to cut down anything, but it's sure better than grinding up rocks and making concrete or trying to make steel.
Yeah. And paving over land.
Yeah. The other answer I always say is, why do we build such big houses? If you're worried about chopping down so many trees, let's build smaller, more efficient houses. And that's where the sufficiency comes in.
Lloyd, we have another question here. Bonnie Bolger, go ahead. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Lloyd. That was so interesting, because I really thought, more seriously about my carbon footprint, but I had no idea even how to go about figuring out what it is or what I should reduce. So you gave me some great ideas. So in your book, I don't know that I will ever do a spreadsheet,
Right.
but so is there some better ideas in your book of just taking those different areas, like how would I calculate, just kind of watch what I do over a month and then kind of try and look what I can do differently, or should I be more aggressive about it?
Well, Harriet, you were mentioning that you're going
Yeah.
to be using an online carbon footprint
Yeah,
calculator.
and I think it's a Canadian one too. And there's a carbon footprint calculator that we're going to use tomorrow that brings in what Lloyd is talking about, the upfront carbon. Okay, so when you see iPhone and you'll see a great big number, you'll know that they've actually calculated in what it costs to make that phone. Am I getting this right, Lloyd?
Yeah.
Or the carbon cost of making that phone. Okay.
The other thing that I always recommend is if you go for that English website, jumpforjoy.org, and you look at what they recommend, you know, without getting into all of the exact numbers of everything, you follow the things that they recommend, and it really leads to a dramatic reduction in your carbon footprint without going through the intricacy of every single thing that you've got. And all of this has to be tempered. I guess that you're living in a very hard part of the world to live, that you're never going to get to 1.5 degrees, but you're going to be able to cut to 2.5 tons of carbon, but you are going to be able to cut it significantly.
We're not that far north. Really, really. I can't wait for you to come up here. Lloyd's coming up here in person. Right, Lloyd?
Yeah, unless this whole thing closes us down again, I'm going to be there in person.
Yeah, for our Sea Sustainability Summit. And I'm hoping that if you can't get to the theater live for the live presentation, we'll be live streaming everything in on Zoom. So it's a hybrid model, and you'll be able to participate that way. So we've got 3 minutes left. Any other questions? I did want to comment on something and I can't remember what it was. It left my head. Okay.
I'll just ask quickly if I can, what do you think about hydrogen cars versus electric or whatever?
Yeah.
Electric is the curve, the efficiency curve is coming down much, much, much faster than hydrogen. Hydrogen cars, you know, Toyota promoted them for the last 20 years. The Alberta government is promoting hydrogen because they say they can make it from their natural gas and sequester the carbon that comes off the natural gas, but it's not realistic. Hydrogen cars, the one benefit of them is you can fill them quickly compared to a battery car that you have to charge it for some time, but they're expensive and they don't work very well, and they're basically a dead end. You're never going to see them on the road.
It's the little changes we make, right, Lloyd, that are going to make a difference. We all have to take some responsibility. This is the only planet we have.
Right.
You know, this is it. So there's another question here from Jari. Just a moment. What's the date for the Sustainability Summit is May 31st, June 1st. This will be part of our itinerary for the month of May. And you're all going to get a front row seat. And remember, it's free. That's a nice word. Free. And it's there's a free lunch, and it's it's not vegan, but it's we are doing our very, very best. Even Lloyd's book, by the way, is made from recycled paper.
Right.
And so we're doing our very best not to start looking at our carbon footprint. Don't get too overwhelmed with those figures. And
No.
But it's good to know. And if we all as a world community, a global citizen, refuse single plastics, the world would change overnight.
Yes.
You know, we got to start thinking, don't think that the impact of one person, collective one, makes a huge, great, big difference. And we have to close, but I want to say, Lloyd, this is an awesome presentation. It's a great learning and inspiration for all of us. And I'm going to be really, I like to push the envelope. I might like you to come back in the fall. Would you consider that?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm putting you on the spot, but I think maybe we could tell you what a difference we made in our carbon footprint too at that time.
I'd like to see that. Remember, you don't need, the one thing I learned from doing the giant spreadsheet is you don't need to do a giant lit spreadsheet. That
No.
it's like the changes that it taught me that you make. Anyhow, I have to zoom from North Bay to New York City. So it's a modern world we live in.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Lloyd. Thank you. Thank you. so much.
Thank you. Bye.